You're in the classroom with Catriona Vo. In the Classroom is a podcast where we talk about all things teaching and learning, education and research. Join me as I sit down with everyday educators and explore what's going on in the field and what this means for sustaining us as teachers in the classroom. If you want to be on the podcast, feel free to reach out to me at intheclassroom.com.au. Today's special guest is Dr. Julie Arnold. Julie is a lecturer in education at QUT, specialising in assessment for learning practices. Before completing her PhD, Julie was a former head of English faculty. She co-authors Cambridge's Essential English for Queensland Schools and serves as the Vice President of the English Teachers Association of Queensland. We're so excited to have her on the show today, and we hope you find this episode insightful for your own teaching. Alrighty, everybody, we're in the classroom today with Dr. Julie Arnold. How are you, Julie?
I'm so well, Catriona. Really happy to be here.
It's so lovely to have you here, Julie. I always start off my podcast with the story about how I met the guest. And our story goes back to 2019 when I was on my last round of placement. And I remember asking my mentor at the time, shout out to Amy, as to whether there was any teacher I needed to observe. And she said, it's definitely Julie Arnold, no brainer. And I remember hunting you down, feeling really shy as to whether or not I could ask you for an observation. But you welcomed me in and you took me under your wing. And I didn't realize how big of a name you were until my first year of teaching. And I saw your name on all of the essential English textbooks. And I was just stunned. So, Julie, you've had this huge career in teaching and in education. I want to know, how did you get into this space? And more importantly, what are you up to now?
What am I up to now? Thank you for that lovely introduction. I do remember you being at Corinda as a pre-service teacher, and you were really such a delight to have. We were so sad not to be able to keep you at the end. My own journey has been in some ways a really straightforward journey. I would describe it as an intentional one. So I have been a career head of Department of English. So I became a head of department after 5 years as a teacher. I was not fully cooked by any means, but I took on that role, and I decided very early on in my career that I wanted to focus on teaching, and I never wanted to exploit my skill deficits, which I would have easily found if I'd been in the roles of deputy principal or principal. There's lots of things that I'm not very good at. But what I wanted to do was create a horizontal career trajectory for myself where I could explore being the best kind of head of department I could be and dive into language and literature with people that I really wanted to work with. And so over time, I started collecting experiences and work adjacent work to do that kept me on that horizontal career path. So the English Teachers Association of Queensland was very important to me at that time. So something that you do know about me is that I wasn't originally trained as an English teacher. I was trained as an economics and music teacher. But I think I turned up on day one and I just looked like an English teacher sometime in 1995. So along with my my music classes, they gave me a grade 11 English class. And so I found the English Teachers Association of Queensland, and they brought me into their fold, and they made me not just look like an English teacher, but actually feel like an English teacher, like part of a community of practice and professional learning that I really desperately needed, of course, because I really wasn't trained as an English teacher. So the English Teachers Association has been very important in that career path, sideways career or parallel career pathway for me. Now I'm the Vice President of the English Teachers Association. I, for many years, ran their professional learning events, and that's been an absolute joy for me, and it still is. I think at one point, the textbook series that I wrote was part of that journey as well, to develop relationships with colleagues. So Linda Wall and I were invited by Cambridge University Press to create an English communication at the time textbook. And so I really enjoyed that. But Kat, the thing that I valued most about it was not producing the book, although that kind of work can have real career benefits, in terms of name recognition, that kind of thing. What I valued was the friendship, that kind of way of thinking of my career as a sideways kind of adventure, probably started to develop into, I guess, an end of career. I don't like to think of myself in my end of career, but I'm certainly in the twilight of my career. So from 2016 to 2019, I did a Master of Philosophy because I felt finally that I should have some proper qualifications as an English teacher, having already been a head of department for 15 years. So I did my Master of Philosophy in teacher linguistic subject knowledge for writing instruction. So I did deep dives into language and literature with teachers in schools. And that was it was such a pleasure to work with teachers on, essentially, Kat, what we did, and you may even have been around at Corinda when I was doing this work, I essentially went to the teachers and I said, what do you need to know about grammar? And they told me what they felt they needed to know about grammar. We learned that together. And then what I studied was how they used that new knowledge when they were teaching students how to improve their writing. And I think I was a little bit hooked. I was a bit hooked from there. So one of those examiners uh, who 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 examined my final thesis, Jill Willis, approached me about joining her to do a PhD. And I don't think that I would have chosen to do, I certainly wouldn't have done a lonely by myself PhD. But if I'd done a PhD, it would have been in linguistics or applied linguistics. But the project that she was on was a federally funded or Australian Research Council linkage project called Accessible Assessment. And so there were 2 PhDs in the project, big team of academics. And so that was it for me. I thought, this is what I can do. I've been a head of department for 20 years. If I'm going to make a change in my career, I'm going to make it now. So 4.5 years ago, I stopped work, and then the pandemic started, and that was a whole bump of its own. But here I am. I was very fortunate at the end of my PhD that there was a position going here as a lecturer. So on the day that I handed in my thesis, I started my full-time permanent job. And academic life is a bit like being a first-year teacher, to be honest. I have no idea what I'm doing anymore, but I'm slowly getting there, I'm coming around. I feel like I know the systems and processes a little better. But that's me. That's my trajectory, I think.
That's incredible, Julie. I just love hearing that story and that journey that you've had. I guess your work with Jill at the moment, you focus heavily on this concept of assessment for learning. Can you unpack that for me as to how assessment for learning is different to assessment for measuring outcomes?
Yeah, so when we talk about, we have all different ways of talking about assessment. And I think particularly in Australia, there aren't many places in the world that aren't confused about the way that they talk about assessment. There are some countries like New Zealand, for example, and Norway as another example, who have some quite clear views about what assessment should look like and what its role should be in the educative process. But I think the simplest way to communicate what assessment for learning really is at its heart is to say that assessment serves its highest purpose when it is for learning. If you are someone whose pedagogical practices are guided by the principles and the practices of assessment for learning, your process every day is to gather information about where students are at and in their learning Interpret that kind of on the spot or sometimes after your lesson, and then respond pedagogically in the practices that you do. Assessment for learning is recognizable by its key practices. There are kind of five. Yeah. So when we do assessment for learning, we make the intended learning clear. So we set clear learning goals. We establish and share and sometimes co construct the criteria for success with students. We ask students questions in a way that elicits evidence of their learning. And sometimes we don't even do it by something I've been working on with pre service teachers is that asking questions is a really difficult skill to master. I'm not sure if you've noticed that. There are lots of things you can do in a classroom to elicit evidence of students' learning. And that's why pedagogical approaches like cultures of thinking have been so popular because they bring routines and strategies that make students' thinking really visible to students. So, learning intentions, success criteria, questions, and other activities that elicit evidence of learning. And then you've got the last two, which are the big agency pieces and also the hardest things for teachers to facilitate in classrooms. I'm sure that you'll agree. Peer and self assessment are the most agentic assessment for learning practices where students are having to make judgments and talk with their peers about what quality looks like and start to make decisions of their own going forward. So essentially that's what assessment for learning is. Easy. Just do all I mean, that and isn't that just the joke of it? Not the joke of it, but schools want teachers to do this stuff, don't they? They want teachers to give great feedback. They want teachers to work on their learning intention success criteria and often write them on the board, make sure they're written on the board at the beginning of every lesson. But each of those practices that I talked about are significant skill sets for teachers to master over a lifetime. And so teachers need a lot of support and students need a lot of support to activate those really well in their classrooms.
It's so true, Julie, because I feel like the minute I learn something, I just want to go into the classroom and run with that. Just automatically dump a whole bunch of questioning on my students, dump a whole bunch of, let's co-construct this together. And by the time the lesson is ending, I find that my students actually haven't done anything. They've actually have just been confused the entire time about what they've meant to learn and what I set out to learn has not been achieved. So, from the student's experience and from the student's perspective, I understand you've done a lot of work on that fragmented experience for students. What can teachers do to make that whole assessment for learning a cohesive experience?
I think you raise a really good point, and it's almost a paradox in assessment for learning that the whole point is to provide clarity and continuity across an experience of learning. But because the processes themselves are complex skill sets for students and teachers to engage with, what seems to be the case is that typical student experience is fragmented by teacher practice, by actual interruptions being called out to an unexpected parade, or the student's sick, so they're not actually there. Uh, Student experience becomes fragmented also just by the fact that classrooms are full of human beings. Teacher instructions may not be clear. I don't know if you've ever noticed any student you taught didn't listen to something that you said. I'm sure it never happens. Yeah. So that's what fragmentation is. What I would argue is that that's normal, and as teachers, we try to fill in those holes all the time. But for some of the students in our classrooms, say the kids that I studied, students with language and attentional difficulties, they experience what I call double fragmentation. So they have all the normal interruptions to learning, and then they're also overcoming barriers of their own. There's quite a few things that can be helpful to teachers in this space. One is working on those set of practices as a framework. So in schools, teachers are often, well, I'm not sure what your experience is, but it can happen in schools that everyone gets on the feedback bandwagon, or everyone has to write the learning intention success criteria on the board, or we're doing a focus on peer assessment, or whatever it is. And when teachers aren't introduced to assessment for learning as a suite of interconnected practices, that's a first place where things can fall apart. If if you're trying to work on your learning intention success criteria, but you're not really thinking about what success what good success criteria can do for you, if you have really good success criteria for a lesson that are really linked to your learning intentions, then you know what to ask questions about. Then you can easily make a checklist that you can use for peer assessment, for example. Considering assessment for learning as a suite of interconnected practices is one thing that teachers can do. Another thing teachers can do that often doesn't happen is that we don't tell students what we're doing. So ideally, students know what the assessment for learning processes are. We're sharing the learning intention and the success criteria today in class. I want you to know this learning intention, and we're going to check back on it in the middle of the lesson. And then at the end of the lesson, we're going to come back to it. So that checking for we often as teachers hear about strategies like checking for understanding is just a thing you have to do. But when you understand it as part of the framework, and perhaps you share those intentions really closely with students, then you can get a lot more mileage out of each piece of practice. A good example here would be feedback. If we teach our students what makes a quality feedback process, and there's lots of different ways that you can do. You can have really nice protocols. You can talk about the. You can give them feedback about their feedback. That kind of meta work. So inviting students to be practitioners of assessment for learning themselves, and then something else I reckon you can do as a teacher, which we rarely do, is find out what's happening for our students. We can do things like, well, I'm not a big fan of us constantly asking students, did they like that lesson, or was that good for you, or what have you. But sometimes we can survey students after a teaching period and ask them to tell us what practices they noticed us doing and which ones they valued. We can keep in mind that even assessment for learning, involves evaluation of some kind, and that is an emotional experience. So remembering that assessment, even if it's just, in inverted commas, assessment for learning, is an emotional experience, is something that we can really pay some attention to with students, out loud recognizing that when we get feedback, especially from a teacher, that it can hit us where it hurts. It can hit a student where it hurts. It can dent their confidence, for example. Being involved in peer assessment can similarly be quite an emotional experience, and we need to recognize that as a genuine barrier in our classrooms that students need to get over, and sometimes need our help to get over.
Thanks for sharing that, Julie. I feel like in my current role teaching a lot of senior students, there tends to be this barrier or challenge in terms of students saying, just give me what I need to know. And I just want the feedback from you. I don't want it from anyone else, but just tell me what I need to hit in order to get these marks and to get out of here. That's pretty much the sentiment that the whole assessment regime, I feel, is molding our students to be. So in terms of that agency and passing that back on to the students and allowing them to participate in that process. I mean, it sounds easy, like just let them do it. But I guess tomorrow, if I was to go into my classroom and think about that a bit differently, how would I challenge some of those dispositions of, just tell me what I need to know in order to get the mark, or let me just show you A, B, C, D level samples so that you can just model this and reproduce this. How can we move students towards empowering them with, you can actually not reproduce things, but you can learn how to make new worlds of text through through what you're learning. Like, how can we move teachers and students to those places in an assessment regime like this? I understand that is a loaded question, but what do you think it takes?
Look, I have been coming back. I've just written a book chapter actually about the concept of washback of assessment, of assessment policies and high stakes assessment practice. And I think here in Queensland, I don't know, people will be listening from beyond Queensland, but I think Queensland is a pretty good case study actually in what happens when we raise the stakes of assessment. We had for many years here in Queensland an assessment process that was portfolio based, and it had been around for so long, so 50 years since we ditched external exams altogether, that I think we didn't realize that what we had was quite a unique system. Even now, I think some people would argue that our external examinations are a pretty light touch approach. So, for those who aren't familiar, up until about 5 years ago, for 6 years ago now, it must be, all of student senior assessment happened via a portfolio system. So, say in English, we would have 6 to 8 pieces of assessment, and we made all of our judgment. We designed the assessment at school, we marked the assessment at school, and we made a judgment based on evidence across the portfolio. And one of the principles was actually the principle, we used to call it fullest and latest, but it's actually a continuous improvement principle. So that the evidence that you gathered along the way in your portfolio was increasingly important for your overall result. And so we didn't know. We would still often talk about, the results you wanted to get in assessment, and that we need to do this for the assessment task. But what we had was a system that was protecting us from those kind of measurement purposes overtaking us, because the system itself was an assessment for learning system. So when you do your first piece at the start of grade 12, and knowing that you can take what you learn there and feed that into the next task and the next task and the next task, you're all doing assessment for learning, even though you don't know it. But when you have a system like we do now, which in some respects is a more reliable system in terms of the accuracy of measurement, when you have 4 assessment pieces and there was 25% no going back, 25% no going back, 25% no going back, and then an external exam, that raises the stakes of each individual piece. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because still, that's a pretty gentle system by global standards, isn't it? Three-quarters of it in English and 50% of it is still marked by the teacher at school, even though there's more robust practices around assessment design and confirmation of marks. But what I think is interesting is the way we've seen our own practices change in response to what was a reasonably modest change by world standards. And so why I want to say this is because that wash back into our classrooms of the higher stakes, certainly in our research, we saw teachers starting to talk about scores and marks and numbers and getting points and losing points. And that discourse in our classroom was not a discourse that had existed. And where it did, where we had those transactional habits, which are just pretty natural, the system protected us from that overtaking as the focus. So I want teachers to be aware of that. We can't control that right now. We can't, we can't change the system overnight. We can give feedback about what we think. But as teachers, if we are critically self-aware of what we're doing in our classrooms that pass on those messages to students. So something that the research tells us is that the way we talk at school with students will be adopted by students. So school level, classroom level talk about assessment is what students believe because they have no other experience. So I think something that we can start doing tomorrow as teachers in classrooms and leaders and administrators is to avoid making for the assessment your reason for doing things in the classroom as often as you can. Resist or notice yourself talking about scores, numbers, points. It's easier to say this than do it. And it's not, or it's not even always necessary. You can't discard the summative assessment piece. It's always going to be there. But what you can do is kind of discursively try and put the joy and the point of learning about this thing just in front of the assessment. Yes, we all know it's there. So we're reading this story, we're reading this poem today because I need you to be able to identify the representations so that when you come to write your short story for your final assessment piece, you can create your own representations and reflect your own beliefs and values and attitudes in relation to that topic. But for now, we're just having fun learning about these poems and what was happening historically at the time that they were written and experimenting with ways we can write about them. So yes, we're getting all this done. But just for now, let's just have fun with these poems. So practicing those different discursive moves, I think, is something that we could usefully do in our classrooms.
That's perfect, Jolie. That is a game changer for how I feel like I'm going to relate to my students when I talk about assessment. It's not show me how much you know on your summative, but it's more so, hey, this is, what we're going to do, but make it your own. Like, show me how you are able to interpret that and reinterpret that and make meaning from this text that you've learned how to produce, you've learned the rules of the game. Show me how you can play it in your own way. So one last question for you. You've been in the field for a very long time. What do you think has kept you going?
Goodness, it's really hard to pin it down to just one thing, but I'm going to do a little assemblage of one thing. I think for me, what keeps me going is, and this is such a cliche, it's relationships, but not just relationships as in the friendships that I make, because I've made some of my most important friendships through education, but the friendships I make with people who care a lot about learning things that I want to learn, and this can be about the incredible things that we do with students and ways we can just keep moving forward and trying to make things better all the time. But I think more often than not, it's about that love of the discipline. What texts are we choosing? How can we talk about these texts? How can we pass our enthusiasm about these texts? The text message conversations I have with various people in my teacher community of practice, where somebody finds a random linguistic sort of eccentricity of someone they've come across on the internet, or a beautiful episode of a television show that we've been watching. Just I think if we keep our love of language and our discipline, or whatever your discipline is, if we keep that at the forefront with the colleagues that we work with, it's much easier for us to take that kind of attitude into our classrooms as well. So I don't know, I reckon that's it.
And that wraps up our conversation with Dr. Julie Arnold. A huge thank you to Julie for sharing her valuable insights and expertise with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate me 5 stars, and leave a review. Don't forget to share this episode with anyone who might find it inspiring. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll dive into more fascinating topics and discussions. Until then, keep learning, stay curious, and take care. Thanks for listening to In the Classroom.